So yeah, psychedelic cannabis. I'll try to make lots of room for talks for questions for people. This is the plan. Is basically a little bit about accessibility, and then harm reduction, and then diving into psychedelic cannabis. So a quote from Monica Williams, basically to sort of bridge into the talk about accessibility. So we all know this. Psychedelic therapy is very expensive, very inaccessible to a lot of people, likely the people that need it the most. So what are we going to do about it? This talk will ask more questions than necessarily give some answers, but there are some answers in, I guess, the work that we're doing in Kingston, Ontario, which is where I live. So yeah, a lot more here, just different articles about accessibility, talking about essentially white privilege and the monetization of psychedelics. So these are like the common things that we look at when we're talking accessibility, right? So the cost is a huge one, having potentially two therapists, traveling, taking time out. Then we got mental and physical contraindicators, medication indicators, and then integration, adding cost, adding time, ego strength, skill set, and clean drugs. And then I want to add on to that, so representation too. So if we if we don't have a therapist who is similar to us in race or gender, then that can make it inaccessible or potentially unsafe to us. Things like stable housing. So a lot of the folks that we want to serve, it would be irresponsible to open them up on a psychedelic and kind of put them back out on the street or into a situation that is unsafe. So that creates more inaccessibility too. There's a ton here. I won't go into all of them, but you can always ask questions, even just like the fixing versus growth models, the clinical versus traditional. So, a lot of people are interested in going into sort of like this cold clinical setting to do a psychedelic, for research or for therapy. So how do we make these more accessible? That's a good question. And then there's also the fawn response. So when I'm working with people, it's often like a lot of people want to be a good client, right? And so they're sort of like, there's this relational aspect of it where they want to please the therapist, they want to be good, they want to have these big experiences. We hear about people going to ayahuasca ceremonies and there's like these big this big dragon came and ate me, and all these narratives and these big stories, and it's like that seems to be sort of what success means in a psychedelic therapy session. So I think it's important to talk about that and to kind of try to more emphasize the present moment experience in the body of healing. I think that's maybe something more to value rather than sort of this big story, this big thing. So that was the accessibility piece, just setting the tone for it here. And then psychedelic harm reduction. So similar thing. So what are the harms, right? We're talking overuse or overstacking processes. So not integrating. I like to call it you're shaking the snow globe and you're not letting the snow sort of settle, or just continuously shaking it. Traumatizing due to emerging material and maybe not in a safe enough container. I really like this piece from Erica Zelfand. A bad trip is a difficult trip and an unsafe setting. I love that because there's always this talk about, well, there's no such thing as a bad trip. It's just difficult. So she really ties that in together. I really like that piece. So yeah, those, wrong doses, spiritual bypassing, all these harms. So normal psychedelic harm reduction would be looking at the proactive side, okay, are the drugs clean? Do we have the safe dosage? Do we have the right setting? All that stuff. And then we have the reactive, which is a lot of the work that MAPS is doing with the Zendo project and things like that. So if someone, didn't do these things or maybe wasn't aware of some of them and they're maybe at a festival or they're at a party, how do we support them in a harm reduction lens with, sort of going towards what's happening, breathing with it. Some people would use sort of energetic or shamanic approaches, but ultimately being a safe presence and sort of allowing people to trust their process of what's coming up. But then what this talk is sort of about or pointing to is that we need to move beyond just that and sort of look at inequality. We need to look at power dynamics. So to go broader, psychedelic harm reduction needs to sort of look at, I guess, the cultural parts of what we're seeing right now, the fix and forget, for example, MDMA for PTSD for folks in the military, right? Sort of healing the PTSD and then going back into war, into battle, right? Instead of sort of taking a broader look back at, ultimately, I think what we want to do with psychedelics is have these paradigm shifts, right? And not necessarily just place them into the current paradigm, because that's often the issue in the first place. Psychedelic evangelism and exceptionalism, like, oh, psychedelics are good, all other drugs are bad, or everyone should do psychedelics, like this is amazing, So these are all harms that we can sort of broaden our harm reduction lens to look at. What else? Yeah, the science only, the silver bullet. I find like half of my job is tempering expectations, because people will, read the Michael Pollan book, or they'll see a Netflix thing and they'll kind of be like, this is my thing, like this is going to heal me. And so part of my job is, tempering that, and really talking more about co-creation and relationship building. So really getting away from, once again, the cultural baggage of, like this pill is gonna heal me, or this person is gonna be my sort of savior. And it's not necessarily explicitly like that, but I think like we kind of hold that. A lot of people hold that as like this kind of like golden shadow type thing of putting power into other people's hands. And then perpetuating privilege and access. No biggie, just some stuff. White male dominant. And I acknowledge that I'm a white male as well. So part of what I do is I'm trying to create more opportunities for others, and sort of step away a lot of times. Where I live, if I'm invited into like a panel, usually my first answer is, okay, let me see if I can find someone else first, and if not, then I'll do it. But trying to create more opportunities for other ways of knowing, other folks. And then the no trip too is something that's interesting, where they want to take the trip out of the psychedelic, and it's essentially an antidepressant. And for me, I think the narrative aspect, like sort of that trip, those difficult moments to move through and to learn that, I think that is part of the healing, right? As well as, of course, like the chemical of the, what the drugs are actually doing to our brains and nervous system. So then I just called it kind of like cultural, collective, or transpersonal harm reduction. And then just threw it into this sort of broader lens of psychedelic harm reduction. So looking at the proactive, the reactive, and the cultural aspect of that. Cool. So let's talk about cannabis, or BIS as it's called. Just joking. Oh, there we go. So a couple articles about cannabis as potentially a psychedelic. So the cannabinoid system, the oceanic experience, the even talk of maybe it activating or being influencing the 5-HT2A, which is like the classic receptor of classic psychedelics. And then for me, it's like, why is cannabis a psychedelic? Well, it's a psychedelic for many reasons, including those, of course. But it's malleable to intention. It's malleable to set and setting. There's an amplification of what's there already, and then there's this sort of like softening of barriers of like the unconscious. So you can get a hold of things that are hidden, and ultimately, this is sort of how I would define a psychedelic anyway. And cannabis can do all these things as well. Not to mention the things that we'll talk about in a second. For me, I've noticed, like working with cannabis with people, there's a lot of this like, what's in the way of it being a psychedelic is the cultural baggage of it, the propaganda, the messaging, and the imagery that we all kind of like have in our psyche. Part of the training I did, it was like a lot of like art-based sort of exploring what are the messages that we received as we were growing up about cannabis, which is really cool. And then sort of like alchemizing that and kind of like letting go of that. And then, it also comes down to right relationship, right? So a lot of times people know cannabis as like the thing that they use when they're stressed out, or they're using it as more of like a symptom reduction. Whereas when we're using it as a psychedelic, it's more of like this, like any other psychedelic, we're kind of like asking it to show us what is underneath the symptom. And then psychedelic cannabis. So this is Daniel McQueen. This is who I learned, got trained by. He's got a book called Psychedelic Cannabis. And it's cool too up here talking about like visual proprioception. So, somatic awareness combined with like visualization and breath work. Really cool, really embodied and grounded psychedelic experience. But also psychedelic cannabis can mimic all the other medicines, which is really cool too. And people often are like, oh yeah, I bet. And then they do it and they're like, holy crap, like you totally undersold this. Like, so I can explain, I can talk about it all I can, but ultimately the real experience of it is the one that people start to really get it and see that it's sort of a bit of a skill set that they can dive into in a deeper way. Yeah, and like it says here, and how I learned it is like cannabis can get to the fascia and release a lot of the stress and trauma that's held in the fascia. So you'll see, well, you won't really see it, but when you're in a session in like a circle that we hold, there's a lot of shaking and like jolting. And it's not like I could see someone like shaking, but people often talk about like, oh yeah, there's really like a lot of shaking. So we name that beforehand just so that people aren't like freaking out because they're like, oh my God, I'm shaking, like is something wrong, right? So a lot of our prep is talking about what to sort of expect in a broad sense, not necessarily like putting ideas in their head of like, this is going to happen, but more, it's just as important as if we're in a room that like, oh, there might be some footsteps you hear upstairs, or there's like a little trickle of water, like just preparing people for that so that when they hear it, it's like, oh yeah, Rich talked about that. Okay, this is normal. Or I'm shaking. Oh yeah, this was named. That's okay. We name paranoia. We name anxiety as something that can happen. We give them tools and sort of frameworks to be ready for that. And then in a sense, we're empowering them to sort of like stay with those edges of the experience. So yeah, some important pieces here, and this is really in response to the harm reduction and the accessibility piece in a lot of ways, is it's like cannabis as an adjunct. So we're not just saying like, yeah, just smoke weed and then everything's fine. It's more of a skill set. It's a set and setting. It's this whole container. There's a synergy of strains, and so there's sort of this like alchemy blend of combining. You can use one strain, but I find it's really cool to combine like sativa, indica hybrid. You're working with different terpene profiles, and you're sort of like letting them synergistically work with each other, which is really fun. And then you get to like build a relationship with the plant too, and kind of get to know the different terpenes and cannabinoids as well. Yeah, and then there's a ton here. I won't go through it all, but basically like a really important piece I think is the mindfulness with the medicine. And that's a pretty awesome idea that I don't think Daniel McQueen like invented, but he really emphasizes, and it's a really important piece to, like I said, to really bring in like the healing, like being present in the moment while the healing's happening in the body. It really helps to land it in the body. And then you can really access it later through like integration work with the somatic piece. And yeah, it helps integrate other medicines, which is really cool. I've seen that happen many times. And like I said, it can mimic MDMA, it can mimic psilocybin, it can mimic even ayahuasca. When you're combining with breath work, it can mimic 5-MeO-DMT states too, which is really surprising and quite powerful. I don't do cannabis and breath work with people until they've done just a cannabis session, because it can be quite evocative and quite vague. And it's a skill set that you want to sort of titrate. What else? Yeah, really cool piece as well with cannabis, unlike other medicines, which can be good or bad, but to be trauma informed in this sense is really cool. So the ongoing consent process. So with cannabis, when you're in the experience, it's almost like the plant or whatever will show up and kind of be like, oh, like, do you want to go to this? Like, do you want to look at this? And it's sort of like, no, I'm not ready. And it's like, okay, cool, right? So with trauma that can often be like too much too fast, if we're going with cannabis, we're moving slowly into it. We're being empowered to kind of like titrate into deeper experiences, which can be really, really powerful. And it kind of has a pause button too. Take the eye shades off, go onto your side, go to the washroom. You're like, oh yeah, I'm a little bit, baked and whatever. And then go back into the room, eye shades on, lying down, and you're right back into the psychedelic experience. So, who wouldn't like a little pause button on their psychedelic experience? So really cool and really empowering, because you're, like I said, co-creating. You're not just like, okay, let medicine like do your work, right? You're building a skill set, you're building a practice, and they can really translate well into life, but then also other medicines. A lot of people, they'll leave the circles and be like, they're like in a new nervous system. Like they feel like they forgot something at the circle, like they've just left behind stuff. And then they bring these skills into life, which is really great. Yeah, I'll leave these here for you guys to check out for a second, just to, like I said, to describe like how this can mimic other psychedelics. These are a lot of the experiences that people have. And a lot of like memory reconsolidation, kind of like in MDMA, a lot of connecting with, other entities or aspects of self, a lot of like moving into sort of like edges of the nervous system. And who was it? So Saj yesterday was talking about how he said, a lot of therapy, they try to keep people in the window of tolerance. And he was saying that, we want to kind of like actually, that's too safe, I think he said. And basically I agree. So what we're doing with this work is we're going to the edges of those sort of like fight, flight, and freeze responses, right? So in the window of tolerance enough to still be online in the frontal lobe, but enough where you're actually like doing the work and you're kind of like activating it and moving the energy and kind of like breaking into new levels of resilience in the nervous system, which is really great. I've often heard people say, like, I actually move towards my anxiety now. Like, I now know how to sort of like trust that it's coming up and I can breathe around it. I can sort of like, I know that it's gonna maybe amplify a little bit and then it's gonna resolve. And Daniel McQueen, he uses Stan Grof's quote, "A symptom is something halfway out." And we always use that as like a reframe before the ceremony, just to give people like, instead of feeling anxiety, I'm feeling anxiety on its way out. And so how do I create the conditions where I can allow this little piece, it doesn't have to be the whole piece, but just like a little piece of this anxiety to sort of like move through and complete and then resolve. And then it's like, oh, that chunk of anxiety that was in my nervous system is gone. So we're like, really expanding that window of tolerance with people without being super safe, but in a safe way where we're encouraging breath and body awareness. And the medicine is quite powerful, but quite gentle. And if people have questions about specific like sort of protocols we use, I may not have time to go through all of it today, but like ask questions or we can chat later. So why is it cool with regards to harm reduction and accessibility? One really cool thing is it's shorter, so we can do a 3-hour cannabis ceremony, and for about an hour and a half, they're in the medicine, and that's like a 3-hour chunk. It's quite easy to integrate, although we still do encourage integration. We have integration circles with it, but it's shorter and it's cheaper and it's a lot safer in groups. I do things in groups where people haven't met. I would never do that in like a psilocybin ceremony. A lot more work put into like building the container and making sure people are good. In this case, we do safety screenings and stuff like that, but it's essentially sometimes strangers in the room together about to go into a ceremony. And I also do them online, which like I wouldn't do that in with any other medicine too. So a lot softer, a lot safer, less contraindicators. You can most likely be on a medication. It's more like what's the medication for is more important than like what's the medication that they're on and does it contraindicate. So yeah, shorter, a lot cheaper because you're doing it in groups. What else? Yeah, we don't use physical touch in there as well. It's a peer model in a sense. Like I'm not there to be the professional. I'm there to sort of like teach. Like we do like classes basically. It's like show up, you learn sort of like what a good psychedelic ceremony can feel like, how it's safe it can feel. And it's cool because ultimately we're teaching people how to do this on their own. But then we're also encouraging the group model with them because there's that edge for a lot of people. Like they don't like to, like it can be an edge, right? Like working with strangers or even friends in a circle. But then I find that the reward of that is so great because you get to notice like your own humanity and be like, oh shit, like, yeah, these people struggle with stuff too, And so even though it's an edge for people, they do find it quite rewarding to be working in that circle. But like I said, it's skills that we're teaching people how to do on their own as well. What else? Let's take a quick peek here. Yeah, like I said, it has a pause. There's a really cool like titration as well. So it's spelled wrong, but that says titration. So when we're doing the circles, a lot of times we'll call in the sacred directions in whatever way sort of like makes sense in our own lineage and our own sort of like teachings. And it's great because we can, you can have like one hoot and then you can kind of see how it feels and you can wait. And then it's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna have a little bit more, right? So we're really like encouraging people to use their intuition and to go slowly instead of like having a crap ton and then like, oh wow, like that's way too much. So it's really cool. You could be lying down and then you're like halfway through the ceremony and it's like, oh, you know what? This is cool. Like I think I'm gonna have a little bit more, right? You can't really do that with other medicines either, which is a really unique part of it. And an important piece, I think, of like the co-creation, the softness of the medicine. There's so many empowering pieces in that as well. Yeah, sweet. Let's see here. Yeah, so like I said, with the accessibility piece, this sort of like is the response to a lot of what I was speaking to earlier. less contraindicators, things like that. Co-creation, co-regulation. So the way that I've learned to sit is essentially I'm regulating my own nervous system, right? And so there's a saying, the strongest nervous system in the room wins. And so if my nervous system is regulated and I'm holding space in a very sort of clean, energetically hygienic way, then the person can just deepen their experience, right? I'm not sort of like looking in on them, and I'm not coming around and sort of doing work around them. I'm letting them ask for what they need. And having a second sitter there is really nice too, just to have accountability, to have check-ins. And then usually what I've been doing is there are a couple folks in town where I live, women and non-binary folks, and they've been trained in the same model. And so they don't have as much experience, but I've been basically getting them to do circles with me to get that experience. And then it's sort of like, oh, do you want to lead like this piece today? So I'm like titrating with them too, of like, do you want to lead this piece? And then they're slowly getting the grasp of it and getting more experience. And then essentially I'll kind of like let them do their thing, and I'll, do something else, or I'll start doing other circles or something. So it's really cool in that way, where you can have this sort of like community grassroots model with psychedelic cannabis too. But quite a great skill set, and Daniel McQueen's training is amazing. There's 3 levels of it, and it's really a really good training. Yeah, it really emphasizes the nervous system and doing your own work. So how we're doing it is, like I said, we're holding not necessarily just like psychedelic cannabis ceremonies, but we're doing these shorter ones that are like classes, and they're skill building, and it's like skill building for life and for other medicines, and community building, right? Like just sort of like getting to know people in that space. And the thing I tell people is like, there's no talking after we imbibe, because a lot of people are like, I don't like to smoke weed and like be social. And it's like totally, you don't have to do anything. Once we imbibe, you're lying down, eye shades, music. Once we come back up, there's this really cool period before the potential sharing, is where the music's still going, but people are coming out of the medicine. They're sort of in the circle, so they're kind of regulating. They're getting used to being in the circle on the medicine. And then I find that's like this really important critical period where I'm not just like calling people back and then like, let's share. It's like calling people back, 10, 15-minute break, music's off, lights are turned up a little bit, and then it's like potential share. It's never, forced or anything like that. Mentorships, things like that we're doing. We're giving free spots. We're doing sliding scale. It's not the only thing I do, luckily, because like it's not, it's like not a way to make money, but I think it's an important piece in sort of balancing a lot of what I'm seeing with like the corporatizing and everything like that. So trying to do it in a way that really builds resilience. So that's our space in Kingston. The city of Kingston gave us a space for 2 years for free, which is really cool. I don't know if they know exactly what we're doing, but don't tell them. And we're using vapes. So we have like 7 vapes. So people bring their own medicine. We add it into a bowl. We mix them together, or they can just bring their own medicine and have their own. So some people do like to smoke. We can't smoke in there. I don't know if we can even vape in there, but we're doing it. That's one of my co-sitters, Denise, being the actor in the set. So that's basically what it looks like. And we have room for about 7 or 8 people. And we have some bigger spaces in town too. So to think in terms of bad actors or abuses of power, hurt people, right? And so what does it look like to it's like if we're using the idea of like parts work, to sort of banish or push away these people or to cancel them, we're not going to really be dealing with the deeper cultural issues. We're just sort of like pushing them away until the next bad actor kind of shows up. So same with parts work, right? If we're exiling parts of our personality, they're going to kind of wreak havoc, and we need to like eventually find ways to work through and heal that part of us, right? So collectively, that's sort of how I see it is, internal family systems on a transpersonal level, and how would we deal with the bad actors, right? And then really it comes down to like regulated nervous systems, and how do we build communities with resilient nervous systems. Same thing like IFS language. If we are working through our own parts, then we're less likely to project them and judge them in others. So really it's emphasizing like the self-work and the resilient nervous systems in our community. And then, like I said, accessible, grassroots, non-hierarchical. We really encourage people to, not do something they've seen, at a retreat or anything. It's really like we're trying to really embody. Like I usually say to people, like I'm like a grounded woo woo. Like you got to bring a little bit of the woo woo in, but like ground it. Like give reasoning. Like why am I calling in the directions? For me, it's often like you're actually orienting the nervous system, so you're helping people to just like settle in. And then when you're calling in things like elements, like we're calling in these resources and these tools and these sort of like ancient images and archetypes that our deep mind knows, right, and knows how to work with. So if we're just going clinical and just going sort of like psychopharmacology, we're missing out on that really important piece, I think, of like the human experience. So we try to bring those in a really grounded woo-woo way. A poetic way, yeah, exactly. Bring the poet. Like I said, the group model is like normalizing the human experience as well. And the group healing, I think, is such an important piece. And it's not necessary for everyone, but it can be an edge, and it can be a really good growth edge for people. Yeah, so just future ideas. We want to get the Watts connectedness scale going with the groups we're doing. We want to just have like creative brainstorms and 1 minute, awesome online ceremonies, connecting communities. So like I said, it's not a medicine, or I wouldn't work with any other medicines on like a Zoom, but we're doing Zoom calls, and it's quite interesting how connected people feel, even though they're like across the city or across the globe or across the country. So it'd be really cool to do these like little pockets of groups online. And then, psycholytic, a little bit like a lower dose, and like maybe sitting up, doing some art intensives or somatic pieces. I really like to combine it with the somatic. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. So thanks.